Revolutions in the Atlantic World, Part 38. The good news is, this is the fourth and last part of this rather long unit. But as far as the number of revolutions we're going to look at, or at least make reference to, however briefly in some cases, we're just getting started. And we've already covered the American and French Revolution. Next, the revolutions in Latin America. And if you look at the map on the screen, the little blue rectangles with dates next to them are all years of successful revolutions against either Spanish, and in one case Portuguese, rule. And we'll also deal with the slightly different kind of revolution, actually quite different kind of revolution in Haiti, which has its own rectangle box in gold color there, kind of in the upper middle of the screen, 1804. We'll get to that as well. And then some of the ideological components of revolution, or ideologies that sort of are integrated within them, inextricable from them. So as our beloved textbook author says, revolutionary ideals traveled to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas. They drew inspiration from Enlightenment political thought, which shouldn't surprise us by now. We've already looked at the Enlightenment and its influence on the American and French revolutions, and occasionally took part in tax revolts and popular uprisings. The Creoles, remember the Creoles are the class of people in Latin America that are those that have they were born in Latin America, but they're of European background and blood. Desired neither social reform nor the establishment of an egalitarian society. Basically, they sought to displace the peninsulares, but retain their privileged position in society. Political independence on the model of the United States and North America struck them as an attractive alternative to colonial status. So they, of course, looked at what was happening a bit earlier, a few decades before, in the U.S. and the colonies there, and said that's the kind of model we want to pursue. We don't want a French-style revolution that overturns the entire apple cart, the whole social order, economic order, redistributes wealth on a massive scale. We just want to get rid of those pesky, annoying European overlords, European monarchies that keep telling us what to do, like the U.S. Did by throwing off the yoke of the British. So this seemed like the route to go, and between 1800 and 1825, Creoles led movements that brought independence to all Spanish colonies in the Americas, except Cuba and Puerto Rico, and established Creole-dominated republics. Remember, the peninsulares are the immigrants from Europe. So these are like the children of the original immigrant leaders, as those who established the colony. This is their offspring who are now sort of saying, no, we don't want to be connected, at least officially, to the home countries, Spain, Portugal, others in other parts of the Americas, of course, Great Britain, France, and Canada. We want to sort of have our own independent country, whether it's Bolivia, Venezuela, etc. On the island of Haiti, around this time, a little bit before most of the others that we just looked at, comes the Haitian Revolution and its great hero, Toussaint Louverture, very German-sounding, French-sounding name. So this Haiti, in those days, was called the island of Saint-Domingue, which is a French colony. So Jamaica, by that time, nearby, another large island, was an English colony, British colony, but Saint-Domingue was one of the biggest islands, biggest sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean, but it was a French colony. And the slaves, and often usually led by free blacks like Louverture, rose up and in a number of years went from kind of starting with a spontaneous slave uprising to eventually forming their own country and ousting the French from their midst and becoming independent. So this is a rather remarkable revolution. The American and French revolutions prepared the way for a violent political and social revolution in Saint-Domingue, as Professor Bentley tells us. So again, not surprising there. revolutionary ideas were spreading around the Atlantic at the time in ways we've already seen. In 1791, some 12,000 slaves began killing white settlers, burning their homes, and destroying their plantations. Within a few weeks, the rebels attracted almost 100,000 slaves into their ranks. So it was started by slaves. There were some slave leaders that were important early on, but then it was sort of became more organized once the fairly small number of free blacks on the island of Saint-Domingue started to step in. The most famous of them, for a good reason, is Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint was a skilled organizer, and by 1793, he had built a strong, disciplined army. He shrewdly played the French, British, and Spanish forces against one another, while also jockeying for power with other black and mulatto generals. By 1797, he led an army of 20,000 that controlled most of Saint-Domingue. In 1801, he promulgated a constitution that granted equality and citizenship to all residents. So the reason it says French, British, and Spanish forces is because the British and Spanish, other Europeans, were put in a kind of an awkward position, at least from their perspective, by this, because since they had colonies nearby, they didn't want, for the most part, a successful slave revolution to happen on any European, controlled island, because it was a bad precedent. The word might spread to a British or Spanish colony, and the slaves might get ideas. So they were concerned in that sense. But as always, France, Britain, Spain, powerful countries, rivals, also, were just that, competitors with each other. And so it put Britain and Spain in kind of the position of thinking, well, this could hurt us, this could help us with regard to our position vis-a-vis the French. But in a series then of moves, Louverture and other leaders and the army that he created, again a disciplined one, declared independence and were able to form their own country with the Constitution, equality, egalitarian values, some of them Enlightenment values, things that we see in the American Constitution. So an important step in a democratic direction in a country that had been before, just before this, a slave colony. Also, I didn't, it's in our textbook, but I didn't put this in here, but Napoleon was the leader of France by the time 1801 came around, actually a little before that, and he sent a force of about 30,000 troops, maybe more, to Haiti to try to overturn this revolution, and failed. And I emphasize that because Napoleon wasn't known for losing a lot, especially in those days, earlier in his military and political career. So Napoleon was used to beating everybody on the battlefield, almost everybody, but he lost. Though he didn't show up to Haiti, he sent a trusted general, but they were French troops in Napoleon's army, so it could still be counted as a victory by the new black Haitian government against the imperialist French under Napoleon. The most famous figure in all of Latin America during this era of independence is Simón Bolivar, pictured here on the left. And he was from Venezuela, but helped his country become a country, go from being a colony to a country, but then was involved in many of the other revolutions in neighboring or at least in fellow Latin American countries. Marshall Eakin, in his General History of Latin America, says between 1776 and 1826, 10 nations, the U.S., Haiti, Mexico, United Provinces of Central America, Gran Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, achieved their independence arising out of the colonial empires of the European powers. Actually, others followed that, or not quite completely independent yet, but were already on their way. A young Venezuelan, at the time of these uprisings, these independence movements, successful in all cases, or at least the cases listed here, Bolivar became the greatest of all the Latin American revolutionary figures, the George Washington of a half dozen South American nations. So he became the George Washington-like figure, not just for Venezuela, but for a number of the others on our list here in achieving independence. True to the spirit of his age, Bolivar was an idealist and a romantic. In early 1813, he brilliantly defeated Spanish forces on the eastern side of the Andes Mountains on the Venezuelan border. In a series of spectacular maneuvers, he defeated the Spanish forces in August of 1813 and returned triumphant to Caracas. He was acclaimed the liberator in October, like the liberator, capital L, and dictator, capital D, in January 1814. But that was sort of him declaring that he was the guy in power now. He still had a little more work to do, and it took some time, defeating Spanish forces at the Battle of Carabobo in 1821, by which time he'd effectively achieved Venezuelan independence. And I'm, of course, skipping a great deal of importance here, but that's a lot of revolutions to cover in one unit. We've already talked a lot about two, so I think you'll probably forgive me and probably be okay with it if I don't go into more detail about each one of these, though they are interesting in their own right. And Bolivar is a spectacular, dashing figure in world history. So now we get into some of the isms. Right, this is one of our major themes in the class. I hope you remember. These are the 19th century political isms, some of which I laid out in our opening lecture, which laid out the three themes of the course, and this is one of them. Ideology and sort of visions. Visions meaning it's visionary, it's idealistic. People thinking about isms tend to have people supporting philosophies that are trying to change the world, not accepting the world the way it is, but pushing for the world, pushing hard for the world that could and should be. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It sounds somewhat, I'm saying it somewhat facetiously, I suppose. I didn't really mean to. Ideology can get out of control, as we've already seen and will continue to see here and further in the class. But being idealistic, which isn't necessarily the same thing exactly, as opposed to a hard-headed realist, has its appeals and has its value. But among other isms, you see them on the screen here, we'll look at liberalism, nationalism, conservatism, republicanism, and socialism. Republicanism, I can't even say it, was the word at the time really for democracy. But I wanted to keep them all isms, so it's nice that they had this synonym for democracy. The old order was being fought against, really by all of these except for conservatism, and the old order being traditional monarchy. So monarchies in France and Spain and Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and elsewhere, and their colonies are being fought against. But these are also isms that have something to do with domestic politics in Europe, and not just their colonies, as we'll see. The French Revolution and Napoleon and the response to them helped to inspire or create modern nationalism. Most historians see the French Revolution as the beginnings of modern nationalism. Remember, the French in their revolution that began in 1789 to dress it up and make it much more attractive to those that needed to participate in it, fight for it. They put forward idealistic and ideological ideas, which they were serious about, but they also knew that they had propaganda value like liberty, equality, fraternity, etc. And so once they started foreign wars, Austria, Prussia, and eventually to other countries, when Napoleon took power on the heels of the revolution, they were then exporting not just French power, which they were certainly doing, but also exporting the revolutionary ideology, which could be seen as sort of a combination of liberalism, nationalism, and actually republicanism, socialism, and nationalism. Not so much liberalism. But a number of isms are in there. And the response to Napoleon, which means that he overran by force with his armies and conquered so many other European nations and kingdoms, that after a time they all got rather sick and tired of being occupied and controlled and governed by France, and so nationalism went the other way. So the French Revolution exported a nationalistic ethos, sort of these isms, but then they sort of came back, boomeranged back on the French, as the Germans, for instance, rallied together in 1813 to bring multiple German armies together to defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig, and with allies drove Napoleon all the way back to Paris, sending him into exile. Not quite ending his career, but it was the first step to defeating Napoleon permanently. As Theodore Hamerow says in a book, a great book about 19th century Europe, that this was a profound change in Europe. A profound change occurred in Europe during the 19th century in the way people regarded the institutions of government. Traditionally, they had been viewed as the temporal, meaning earthly, manifestation of a hierarchical principle of authority that was sacred in character. The divine right of kings, like that God supports the king who's in power. The royal will had to be obeyed for the same reason that the divine will had to be obeyed, because they were connected. The French Revolution had the effect of undermining not only the accepted institutions of government, but also the beliefs on which they depended. Authority became desanctified and demythologized. Rival public ideologies began to emerge in public life that were designed to express the interests of economic groups and social classes in the form of timeless laws of government. So rival public ideologies, the red isms we see above, are among them. Those are the big ones. So ideologies in the multiple sort of spring up as the idea of divine right of kings fades and is no longer is no longer works in terms of legitimization of power, and so then a number of candidates to replace it sort of step in, and their supporters compete with each other to make theirs the ideology. And what do I mean by the ideology? So the rise of the isms, ideology, primarily 19th century Europe. I make the definition quite simple here. We could go into much more depth and detail. We won't. What is ideology? A philosophy that tells you that it is right and all others are wrong. I like the little joke poster on the right. Right, but that could be said about all the isms. That little poster could put up there for liberalism, conservatism, etc., as well. Especially in that our ideology is the only one that makes sense. It's the one you should buy into. The rest of them are wrong. Ours is right. Period. So ideology is a philosophy. It can be political. It can be an economic philosophy, a religious one. But it's not just a philosophy that's sitting there, and I may have said this before in an earlier lecture. It's not just sitting idly by, indifferent to whether you notice it or not. It's an ideology that's coming by and wants attention and wants you to be sort of part of the ideology. So it's not just a philosophy saying, okay, this is my philosophy, and it's this, and I don't really care if you like it or don't like it. No. An ideology, an ism, is trying to sell itself, and its supporters usually are, many of them anyway, are true believers that ideology is the right way to form an economy, the right way to form a government, the right way to understand how the world works. The politicalisms, we see some of them that are on our screen before are here, but there's some more specificity here, which you don't need to really worry about. I just like that side just so that it is more complicated if we wanted to be more complicated. So let's take liberalism first. This is what we today call classical liberalism. And for lack of, there were liberals, conservatives, socialists from all kind of economic classes, socioeconomic backgrounds, but primarily, right, the major sort of public for liberalism were middle class, the bourgeoisie, as Karl Marx called them. So this can be seen as the ideology of the middle class. Keep in mind, in those days, the middle class really meant the capitalist and professional classes. So businessmen, merchants, bankers, doctors, lawyers, professors, government officials, college educations, etc. And it was a small class. Today we think of the middle class defined usually by income, which it wasn't necessarily defined by income in Europe in this day and age in the 19th century. But this included sometimes people that were super wealthy, but they weren't nobles. Because a banker, a businessman, can be a very successful one and very wealthy, but they still, unless they had a noble title, a duke or baron, or acquired one because of their success, from the king, from the government, they were considered middle class. So liberalism, the ideology of the middle class, one of its sort of most famous supporters, though sometimes he's thought of as a conservative as well, I'll get to that, is Alexis de Tocqueville, who you see here, a French politician and intellectual, more known for his intellectual work, which we've already seen, at least briefly. De Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, 2 volumes, after visiting America for just several months and writing what has ever since been considered one of the most brilliant commentaries on American society and government and culture. He was a Frenchman. That was his only time in America, and he sort of nailed a lot of things about America, and Americans have recognized it. That's why his book, his 2 volumes, have been studied and assigned in college political science courses ever since. So he's just one of many liberal political leaders and thinkers of the time, but he certainly is a good standard bearer, so I'll use him. I could use a few others in his place. Liberal individualism is at the top of the liberal ideology, which means that society, that liberalism, classical liberalism, the kind we're looking at here, is sort of centered around the idea that the individual and the individual's rights have to be kind of the focal point, the center point for everything else in society that has to be built around that. So that the rights of the individual, like life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, are all, they all are the centerpieces of political institutions, economic institutions. If you don't, according to the liberals, if you don't sort of pay attention first and foremost and start with the importance of defending, promoting the liberty, the freedom of the individual, nothing else works, nothing else is just, nothing else is fair. You don't have a successful, a powerful, really worthwhile society. Enlightenment thought was extended here, so it's the liberals really here that are the torchbearers of Enlightenment thought. Remember, the Enlightenment thinkers were all about the individual civil liberties as well, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc. What you see there, religion, also scientific reasoning only. So these again are the descendants of the Enlightenment figures. Free markets, so this is capitalist. The Enlightenment figures were also pro-capitalist. Reform-minded, utilitarian, meaning that this was a project to improve the world, to bring about progress. The liberals were touting this idea big time. They believed, for the most part, in parliamentary or representative government, but there was a certain wariness about democracy, not outright rejection of democracy, but a concern about it. De Tocqueville himself is a great example of it. As a French nobleman, he believed that democracy was the wave of the future, that it was inevitable. He could have been right in France and everywhere else. And it's partly why he went to America, because America's democracy was much further along than France or any other European countries. And since he believed it was inevitable in France, the place to go to study it would be the United States, since it was more mature there and sort of more fully fleshed out. So he went to study it. But that doesn't mean he was necessarily wild about democracy. He thought it was inevitable. We have no choice. So if it's going to be here in France, it's going to be the direction our society goes, whether we like it or not, we might as well get good at it and figure it out. So he was really more of a reluctant believer. He says in Democracy in America, the main evil of the present democratic institutions of the United States does not arise from their weakness, but from their irresistible strength. I am not so much alarmed at the excessive liberty which reigns in that country as at the inadequate securities against tyranny in that country. And partly what he meant was sort of tyranny of the majority and the idea of democracy or equality of outcome, which means sort of policies that force everybody to be equal in the amount of money they have or property or something even moving close to it. He also said in America, the majority raises formidable barriers around the liberty of opinion. Within these barriers, an author may write what he pleases, but woe to him if he goes beyond them. So there's sort of an idea here that, again, James Madison's phrase earlier, but it could be applied to Tocqueville just as well, tyranny of the majority, which Madison worried about and de Tocqueville worries about here. And as a nobleman, he didn't necessarily have a great deal of faith that the average non-noble person, at least one that didn't go to college, had the wherewithal to be able to participate in politics in a meaningful way, or in a way that was, intelligent and worthy of having the vote bestowed on such person or persons. So keep in mind that classical liberalism, as I think I said in one of our earlier segments here, is not the same as liberalism as defined today in our country, because classical liberals focused so much on the importance of individual freedom and liberty, right? Put liberal individualism at the top of the list here, that they also believed very much in limited government. And that doesn't really fit with liberalism today in this country, because of the two reigning ideologies, the mainstream ones, conservatism and liberalism. By our standards today, liberalism is the one that's much more optimistic about government and government programs and government taxation being worthwhile and government spending being something positive. So I think I said at the outset that 19th century liberalism, classical liberalism here, and 19th century conservatism would both be considered kind of conservative in our world today. These guys are kind of like libertarians in a sense. They're very wary about too much power in the hands of government, like the American founders were, as we've seen, not so much like the French revolutionaries, who were much more pro-government, to what ended up being, as we've seen, a vicious extreme. Not that it always becomes that extreme everywhere. Conservatism, holding on to good things, as one writer has said. And the person I've chosen to be its exemplar here is another politician that came a little bit earlier than de Tocqueville, across the English Channel in Great Britain, Edmund Burke. And Burke was a politician and intellectual like de Tocqueville, both of whom are known really more for their intellectual output and writings, books, and newspaper articles, etc., than they are for their politics. But they were big-time politicians in their own day. Burke is hard to classify really in any one ism as well, but he's, I think, still rightfully usually considered the father of European conservatism. So he believed that, I think I mentioned him before, because he wrote his most famous book about the French Revolution, an essay, really, an extended essay called Reflections on the Revolution in France. He's the guy who early in the revolution, even before it got to the Reign of Terror, already believed what the French were doing was crazy, by throwing out everything about their old society and culture and government and replacing it with untried, untested theories, abstract ideas that had never been tried, and they had no idea whether they were going to work or not. So this is the one piece of writing where his conservatism comes out the most. So what did conservatives believe in Europe and other parts of the world as the ideology spread to some degree? Belief in some transcendent order. So the conservatives were somewhat suspicious of the Enlightenment, not a total rejection of the Enlightenment. Burke didn't reject Enlightenment reason and science, but also believed in something transcendent, God, at least in a vague sense, if not in a more traditional sense. They also believed that there was a fixed human nature, and that human beings, for the most part, right, had a nature that had both good and bad potential within it, and that it could only be changed a little bit. Enlightenment oriented thinkers and liberals, then, who would be kind of progressives now, tended to and tend to believe that human nature is malleable, in some cases almost unlimited malleability, that we can sort of change and reform human nature and perfect it. The conservatives were and even are today much more wary about this. And so there was a belief in a fixed human nature, and as it says at the top of the screen, they believed in limits of human reason, that it was utopian and reckless in a French revolutionary kind of way to believe that reason could perfect humanity, could perfect society, that could perfect human nature. They believe without a realistic reflection about what human beings are capable of, both good and bad, and what they're not capable of, without a realistic assessment of that, you're likely to go off the rails. The conservatives, like Burke, believed in liberty and its importance, but that it must be synthesized with family, community duties, duty to country, etc. So that you didn't just have rights as an individual, you had obligations and duties to your family, to your neighborhood, to your country, etc. They thought freedom and property were very much linked, so they shared this with liberals, that the right to private property had to be seen as sacrosanct. In this sense, both liberals and conservatives of the 19th century would be conservatives in that way today. They believed in tradition, custom, history, and evolution. I don't mean the Darwinian. I don't mean in the Darwinian sense. Darwin wasn't around yet, but meaning that societies and cultures, countries, they make progress gradually, slowly, piece by piece, generation by generation, not by throwing everything out in one generation and replacing it in an overwhelming French Revolution type situation. They tend to look back on history to find guidance for how to construct or reconstruct or reform the present set of institutions, etc., to custom, to tradition. Doesn't mean they believe that tradition and custom and history should never be changed. But they're saying, when we can, when it makes sense to hold on to something, holding on to good things, we should. We shouldn't do what the French did in the Revolution and throw out the good with the bad just to be able to say, we're cleaning house and we're going to start from scratch. Conservatives were not wild about the idea, to put it mildly. They believe that such customs and traditions and institutions, systems evolve and gain wisdom over time. So that throwing out the entire system like the French did in 1789 and after is like sort of throwing out wine before it's been allowed to age properly. That there's a certain wisdom that sort of accrues gradually over time through the generations. Burke said in one of his famous passages that human beings, sort of in the present and individually, are foolish, but the species is wise, meaning that wisdom sort of aggregates slowly over time. It's not one person that's wise necessarily, but you put 5, 10, 20 generations together, and a lot of wisdom sort of comes out ever so slowly. Change must be done gradually from the conservatives' perspective, and with a lot of circumspection. So it's not an ideology, unlike the liberal ideology we just looked at, which is sort of overwhelmingly positive about change. The liberals tended to think change in and of itself is a good thing. The conservatives saying no, unless it needs to be changed, unless it's really an evil and really something unjust in a major way, we should probably think about keeping it and not changing it. So don't change unless you have to, but change when you have to. Reason is limited. Humans should be careful to avoid grandiose planning. This fits in with everything we've been saying higher on the list here. They didn't believe that human beings could perfect themselves. They believed they were taking an honest look at human nature and recognizing that human beings can do only so much. And if we get too big-headed and too overconfident, we can cause disaster for ourselves. And so they were in many ways opposed to they were opposed to what we call social engineering projects today. The human beings in their minds just aren't capable, for instance, of structuring an economy sort of top down, a planned or controlled economy like a socialist economy. Conservatives then and conservatives now scoff at the idea as impossible. There's always trade-offs. This is also a conservative idea that does fit with the present conservative mindset. So many of these things, as I said before, and I've said here, aren't conservative in today's 21st century America version of conservatism, but a couple of them are, especially these last two. Trade-offs. There's no perfect answers for conservatives. Burke certainly thought so. No, the best you can do is make wise choices, meaning if you choose this, it's better than that, but there are going to be costs. There's going to be a price to pay. You're going to lose some things no matter what you do. There's never sort of a perfect solution, or at least very rarely. Burke said a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve would be my standard of a statesman. So my standard of a politician would be a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve. So that captures what I've said in much less succinct form perfectly. So a disposition means a tendency, right? His tendency would be to preserve first, and that would be the default position. Preserve what we have now, but have the ability to improve when necessary. So the default position is to preserve for a conservative, and only in certain situations do we move to changing that by improving. He said also at the bottom left, it's a general popular error to suppose the loudest complainers for the public to be the most anxious for its welfare. And you can interpret that one on your own. Whenever a separation is made between liberty and justice, neither, in my opinion, is safe. So that idea is still around today amongst conservatives and some liberals as well. If that wasn't enough of a mouthful on liberalism and conservatism, now we have to deal with socialism. Really, all of these isms are born in and of the French Revolution. So they really were all born kind of there. Socialism has been called a cry of pain for the masses. Its emphasis is on the collective. I should have said something else. I'm sorry. If liberalism is the ideology of the middle class, conservatism was the ideology of the old order, meaning king, nobility, church, and those traditional institutions. So there's another way you can see that it's not conservatism in the modern American sense of the word. Nobles who wanted to maintain noble privilege, at least what was left of it after the French Revolution, were in some ways on shaky ground because liberalism was looking to sort of obliterate all those, and had in France certainly, for the most part. Remember the night of August 4th. Socialism is the ideology of the masses. At least it was intended for the masses. Socialist leaders tended to be people that came from the middle classes, and once in a while even the nobility, who were kind of traitors to their class, and dedicated their lives, or a large portion of it, to supporting the rights and the livelihoods of the masses. Henri de Saint-Simon, you see there, a utopian socialist, as they're sometimes called. Karl Marx actually labeled them that, which wasn't meant to be a compliment. He thought these early socialists were before him. Saint Simon lived before Marx came to the fore, but he thought these type guys, and there were other utopian socialists were pie in the sky type people, too idealistic, too unrealistic. Marx believed that he was presenting, by the time he came around, a much more pragmatic, hard-headed, realistic socialism, which is arguable in itself, but he had a point about Saint-Simon and some of the others. One introduction to 19th century socialism book says the unfettered competition of capitalists is replaced by in a socialist system and society is replaced by cooperation, and the business cycle by planned stability, a planned economy, to root out competition and replace it with cooperation and stability as much as possible. Often they believe, socialists, like the early Christians, that property should be shared in common and private ownership of industry and land abolished. Many 19th century socialists rejected the argument that the wealthy deserve their wealth because they have created it, instead believing that wealth is created by the working classes and wrongfully appropriated by the rich, who benefit disproportionately from their underpaid labor. So inherent in socialist thought from the beginning, whether of the utopian sort or the supposedly scientific sort coming later through Marx and others, is the belief that the rich always take advantage of the poor. Anything the rich earn, they earn on the backs, off of the backs of the poor, the masses, the workers, and basically steal from them. And so it's capitalism is always unjust. Private property is always unjust. The inequalities are endemic, inherent in the system. So the only way to get rid of the injustices are to get rid of capitalism entirely. So socialism is a cry of pain for the masses, but it sees capitalism as the main problem and is a major critique. I can't say it. Major critique of capitalism, but it is working on behalf of and does include some of the masses. Though many socialists here and beyond become frustrated with the masses when they don't tend to share their ideas about socialist revolution overthrowing capitalism, get frustrated when workers just want like their unions or their leaders just to get better wages for themselves and better working conditions, fewer hours, paid vacations, whatever it is. It's like, wait a minute, that's still capitalism. You're just asking for breadcrumbs. Well, that's what we want. We want to be able to feed our families and work for better pay. No, no, no. You need to overthrow the entire capitalist system and replace it with socialism. So you can see here that the socialists had something in common with the liberals, and in this sense would did run afoul of the conservatives, who were suspicious of overthrowing anything that was too ambitious a project for human beings in their minds to sort of make work successfully. So it's a moral concern for the masses, rejection of capitalism on both moral and economic grounds, an emphasis on collective, the collective or the individual. So not so much interested. I'm not saying it rejected entirely, but not so much interested in individual rights as the liberals were, and even the conservatives were. They believed in government public control of the means of production, a Marxist term. Just same idea. The term comes later, but this means government control of industry and the economy. So businesses are primarily owned by the government / public, like the steel industry or the textile industry, whatever it may be, the railroad industry in time, instead of being owned by business, private entrepreneurs and capitalists. They believed in redistribution of wealth and property towards equality. So this is equality of outcome they're talking about, which liberals like de Tocqueville were precisely what they were worried about. Equality of opportunity. De Tocqueville believed, he believed in equality of opportunity. Now I'm confusing you. He didn't believe in equality of outcome. So equality of opportunity, de Tocqueville as a liberal and a conservative, kind of both, believe that yes, the political system, the legal system, the culture, the society, the customs should be there, the laws, to create as much as possible a level playing field, to give as many people as possible the chance to succeed and be happy and live a good life, so they have opportunity. But equality of outcome is something different. That's going farther and saying government or leaders of society have the responsibility, have the obligation to bring you equality, so to give you equal outcomes. Thomas Jefferson, of course, in the liberal camp, we already covered him, but life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as I pointed out at the time, right? It says pursuit of happiness. So the government's job, the law's job, is to put a system in place that allows you to pursue your happiness. So Jefferson was not a believer in equality he was a believer in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. You should have the opportunity to pursue happiness, but it's not the government's job to hand you happiness. Saint-Simon said, true equality consists in each drawing benefits from society in exact proportion to his social outlay, that is, to his real capacity, to the beneficent use he makes of his abilities. And this equality is the natural foundation of industrial society. That's an idea that will come back later in Karl Marx. And speaking of Karl Marx, here he is. In his some of his earlier writings, which were discovered after his death, actually long after his death, the Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, we see his major theme there here was alienation under industrial capitalism. That it's an alienating economic and social system. So this is already early on in his career making a strong case that capitalism sort of destroys the human spirit. That's what kind of alienation is. If you're alienated, it means you're downtrodden, you're depressed, you want to give up, you don't see sort of any meaning, any point, any purpose. He thought capitalism was sort of soul-destroying in that way. Human beings became alienated from the product they produced under industrial capitalism, meaning if they work in a factory job. Humans alienated from other people under an industrial capitalist system. Humans alienated from themselves in the end. This is where they really start to lose sort of sense of meaning, and their morale goes down as they're just working, coming home, eating, going to sleep, getting up and working again and again and again. And they seem to be kind of prisoners of the capitalist system and capitalist bourgeois owners, managers. The Communist Manifesto, the most famous piece of writing, along with Das Kapital of Karl Marx. This he co-authored with his partner in crime, Friedrich Engels. I don't mean crime literally, but Engels, a fellow German, both German thinkers. Engels was one of those rich guys that became a socialist. And by the way, he didn't give up his own money, but he still believed in socialist principles in a socialist society. The pamphlet that set the world on fire, the Communist Manifesto, since this is a great example. I'm not going to read that quote to you, but you should read it yourself. It comes from the manifesto itself, famous words. But it's a good example of how ideas can and do change the world. Marx's ideas, not in his own lifetime even, so it was gradual, but eventually did set the world on fire. The Russian Revolution we'll see, the Chinese Communist Revolution we'll see, and others like them, smaller versions of them, were based on Marxist principles. We don't have to just go back and figure that out. They were overtly based on Marxist principles. Republicanism, again, this was the word at the time for democracy, and so the gradual rise of democracy. We have it in our power to begin the world over again, as Thomas Paine famously said in one of his many famous writings in his own lifetime. The Republicans then were a minority because democracy sort of wasn't the main ideology at the time. This one was picking up some steam, but really came into its own a bit later, as socialism did. At the time we're looking at these, it's liberalism and conservatism, the European versions of those ideologies, that are the two most potent, meaning most popular. But the Republicans believed in popular sovereignty, which means sort of that the consent of the governed, the people, at least in theory, construct their own government, not the other way around. So this was already true in the United States. Rejection of hierarchy, at least monarchical and hereditary hierarchy, like nobility. Representative government doesn't necessarily mean democracy per se. We have representative government today, though I would say we are a democracy in many other ways. But representative just means that somebody that you elect goes and makes laws, but you still don't. But they're accountable to you every so often at elections. Mixed government mixed between government initiative and limited government. So early Democrats like Paine, or Republicans like Paine, believed that the government needs to sort of go a little further sometimes than liberals believed, but still we're kind of in the limited government category. So didn't want to see it get sort of out of control and balloon too much. Individual natural rights, freedom and equality, and some of the Democrats like Paine were moving already kind of in the direction of equality of outcome, not just equality of opportunity like liberals and conservatives believed. Or some conservatives believe. Basically, all liberals did. Property rights they still held as sacrosanct. So on that, they disagree with the socialists and agree with the other two ideologies, conservatism and liberalism. So I've given you kind of a whole stew here of components of the four isms we've looked at so far and how they kind of mix and match or don't match with each other. Burke and Paine had an exchange intellectually with each other, disagreeing over the French Revolution and other things. But Paine said about Burke famously in Burke's lament for Marie Antoinette, the queen of Louis XVI, who was guillotined along with her husband as part of the French Revolution. But Burke, in his famous book on the French Revolution, basically felt sorry for Marie Antoinette and her fate, and caustically, Paine commented about Burke, he pities the plumage and forgets the dying bird. So he's saying he feels sorry for the fancy costumed and sort of decked out queen and king, but forgets about the poor suffering people, the average peasants that have been suffering for hundreds of years under that their stupid absolute monarchy, at least according to Paine. He said, I'm contending for the rights of the living and against their being willed away by the manuscript assumed authority of the dead. What does that mean? It means we're too imprisoned by the past. We're too bogged down by thinking about tradition has to be respected and customs and history to be respected. The Republicans, the Democrats, no, they don't. We need to think about the future. We need to think about change. So this is a very change-oriented ideology. Eric Foner, one of the great current historians in the United States, says in one of his books, through this new language, Paine communicated a new vision, a utopian image of an egalitarian, meaning equal, Republican, which means democratic society. So it's very idealistic, but these are really kind of the foundations of modern democracy. And again, there are other representative figures that I could put. Paine certainly is a good stand-in for anybody else that I could use. Nationalism. This is an ism that is extremely influential, and really all of the previous political isms we've just looked at, liberalism, republicanism, whatever, could be a nationalist at the same time. As one French historian in the mid-19th century wrote, do not tell me how pale France is. She has shed her blood for you. So nationalism in part includes sort of patriotism, or patriotism and nationalism at least sort of linked together. What is nationalism then? Again, I give you a simple working definition. That's really all we need. When your identity as an individual becomes sort of infused more and more with the nation. So when somebody says, I am, and I'm a tennis player, I'm a vegetarian. I'm left-handed. Right? Those are, everybody has different, has a number of features to their identity, who their self-definition, who they think and believe they are. But the higher on the list, the earlier in answering that question, that you'd say, I'm a Frenchman, or I'm, an Italian, I'm Japanese. The sooner you sort of say that, the more nationalistic you are. And I should say this, and I think I said it earlier in the class too, since this isn't the first time we've dealt with the word nationalism, and I've said it in some of the sessions in our meetings, but nationalism isn't necessarily or a good or a bad thing. I would say it's sort of neutral. It depends on what you do with it. Nowadays, in our current society and situation, it's almost always used as a pejorative, as a negative, like white nationalism. And of course, in that iteration, that type of nationalism is, utterly reprehensible. But unfortunately, in the media today, doesn't always sort of give you a great deal of historical insight. And so it doesn't sort of focus on ways in which nationalism can be a positive thing as well. The one I mentioned earlier, I'll repeat, just to show you that it can be almost unarguably a good thing, depending on how it's done, what it's used for. Nationalism was the primary ideology, really, behind the movement for Indian independence from British control. The people of India, India was Great Britain's biggest and sort of most prized possession as a colony, and the people of India rose up, starting in the 19th century, finally getting independence about 100 years later, a little less, after a nationalist movement that basically said and worked towards the idea that the British shouldn't be governing us. We should be governing ourselves. These people are foreigners that came by force hundreds of years ago and conquered us, and they don't have any right to rule over us, and we're going to fight against it, and we're going to eject them, and we're going to run our own country. We're going to get rid of British control, British power, like the American colonists had done. This is later. But nationalism wasn't really an ideology at the time of the American Revolution. By this time, it was. And so nationalism as a mode of thought, as an ism, did spread around the world, and it had a potent impact on India in a way that's hard to argue isn't anything but a good thing, at least if you're Indian, right? Of course, if you are governed by some foreign power, some foreign people, and you don't want to be, and it's your own country, anything that helps you fight for freedom and independence, almost all of us, hopefully all of us, would think of as a good thing. So there's at least one, there are others, one example of nationalism carried out and sort of put into action that ended up being a good thing. It brought independence and freedom for the people of India, no longer under British control after the nationalist movement was successful. There are both cultural and political nationalism or nationalisms. Cultural nationalism is also a version that is generally, completely benign. The German nationalist thinker and writer Johann Gottfried von Herder, who wrote a book about language. He certainly was pushing Germans to be proud of their German lineage and their culture through looking at folk music and folklore and mythology and folk tales, etc. But just being proud of your own cultural background, whatever it is, again, isn't a bad thing. It's usually considered a good thing. The problem is cultural nationalism can easily go from thinking our culture is sort of unique and worth being proud of to believing and saying our culture is we're so proud of it, we believe ours is superior to yours. So it can cross over and become dangerous. Political nationalism is usually when those cultural ideas become about us versus them and we're better than you kind of mentality. But even political nationalism, as we've just seen in the example of India, can be a healthy development as well. It also helps countries to unify as well as become independent, like India, and we'll see Italy and Germany as well. Giuseppe Mazzini, pictured at bottom, was the leader of the Young Italy movement. Italy was fragmented at the beginning of the 19th century into multiple countries. There wasn't one Italy, and there never had been. They had an Italian language and Italian culture, basically, but there had never been one Italian country. Just like there are several English-speaking countries now in the world, but they don't answer to each other. If you're Australian, you don't have to answer to American law, even though you might speak English. You do speak English as your primary language. So the Italian city-states were all separate and independent. But Mazzini was one of the first, certainly not the last, at least one of the first prominent believers in a unified Italy. And it was Italian nationalism, this ideology that supported the idea of more and more of your identity being poured into your national, cultural, in this case, Italian background, that helped to push for political, economic, and overall Italian unification. So we'll start looking at this because this is a very important development, both good or bad or both, that is about nationalism. The whole process of Italian unification being brought together in one country took a number of decades, and a number of important leaders, Mazzini, who we just looked at, and two others, Cavour and Garibaldi, usually the three that are seen as the standouts, that took this massive territory, and I like the little map there, hard to see because it's small, but the bright colors show you how divided Italy was in these different countries and kingdoms. So those were all separate political units with separate laws, and if you lived in the red area, you didn't have to follow the laws of the yellow area. If you lived in the yellow area, you had to follow the laws of the yellow area, but not the light green area, because these are separate countries. This is what they're trying to get rid of. Leaders like Cavour, who is the prime minister, not the king, but the prime minister, so the day-to-day politician, like a president, in the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, the kind of tan area, the island of Sardinia, and the northwesternmost part of Italy, where Genoa and Turin are. And that happened to be the most powerful and wealthy of the Italian states at the time. So Cavour, who believed it was a good thing, it would be a good thing for Italy to unify into one country, because his particular Italy was one of the most powerful, or the most powerful, he played a large role in making it happen. Giuseppe Garibaldi, in a different way, as sort of this crusading, charismatic military figure, helped in his own right. And to take a quote from Bentley and kind of squish it together to make this concise, in alliance with France, they needed a larger ally to make this happen. Cavour expelled the Austrians from most of northern Italy in 1859. To complicate this even more, I should say, with Italy divided, never unified until we're getting close to it here in its entire history, into these small little, city-states, they were sitting ducks for being taken over by larger countries. France from the northwest, Austria from the northeast, and so they'd been occupied and overrun and had their freedom taken from them on numerous occasions. So when it says here, Cavour, his armies anyway, expelled the Austrians from most of northern Italy, that's saying that up until 1859, Austria had a strong presence in northern Italy, basically, running it as a colony. Then Cavour turned his attention to southern Italy, where Garibaldi, the guy on the right, a dashing soldier of fortune and a passionate nationalist, led the unification movement. With about 1,000 men, Garibaldi swept through Sicily and southern Italy. So he used a lot of guerrilla tactics and techniques, because 1,000 soldiers isn't a lot when you're trying to take down something called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Naples as its center, but the island of Sicily as part of it. But Cavour had to try to work with Garibaldi and kind of slow him down in some ways to maintain political control. Then he knew Garibaldi's forces were doing important work in kind of rolling up, destroying one of the kingdoms, separate pieces of Italy, and its sort of political machinery. He didn't think that Garibaldi wanted to or should take over politically. Fortunately for him, Garibaldi didn't have a desire to do so. He was doing this sort of more out of kind of patriotism and idealism and kind of romanticism. Cavour was a much more hard-headed, realist, sort of lawyer, businessman type guy, so it's his country, again, Piedmont, Sardinia, that once this whole process was complete in 1861, got to have the leader. Victor Emmanuel was the king that Cavour had worked for before, who was the king of Piedmont, Sardinia. But after this process was finished, he was crowned the king of Italy. And Cavour then became more powerful as the prime minister of United Italy, not just one piece of Italy. So again, another complicated series of events. If that's not complicated enough, then we get the unification of Germany that was completed about a decade later and started just after the Italians successfully unified. And certainly the Germans looked to Italy for signs or for evidence of what worked and what didn't work. So Italian unification coming first certainly helped Germany. There's one figure that stands kind of towering above all the others in the process of German unification, unlike Italy, and that's the guy pictured here, Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian nobleman. Prussia was a small kingdom within the larger Germany. So the same situation that we just talked about in Italy applied in Germany. Germany had never been a unified country before. There was a German language, there was a German people, a German culture, German bratwurst and beer. There were cultural differences from place to place slightly, but there was such a thing as the German people. So they saw themselves united in a sense culturally, but not politically. In fact, it wasn't just several different countries like we saw on the map of Italy. It was dozens and dozens of them, sometimes very tiny ones. One city was an independent country in some places. So this is a much more messy process of unifying. But the German people was a much larger group than the Italian people. And so once Germany unified, it changed Europe considerably and in a way that concerned many people, many leaders in other capitals like London, Paris, anyone that was even close to Germany. The Iron Chancellor, as he was called, this really tough guy with an indomitable will, Bismarck's sovereign self, as it says here, according to one good biographer, is a reference to this guy's sort of willpower. He's just one of those people that has such a will to get his way, as well as the ability. He was a super smart guy as well. Also not the nicest guy in the world either, difficult to get along with, through tirades and tantrums, even at his king. Prussia, as one of the German states, had their own king. He was the prime minister or chancellor, the guy that did the day-to-day work, but he had to answer to the king. But he got his way most of the time because he threw tantrums and knew how to manipulate the king and do all kinds of sort of underhanded things to get his way. As Professor Perry, who writes a textbook that I use when I teach Western civilization, says, Bismarck recognized the great appeal of nationalism and used it to expand Prussia's power over other German states and strengthen Prussia's voice in European affairs. By heralding his state as the champion of unification, Bismarck gained the support of nationalists throughout Germany. In the past, the nationalist cause had belonged to the liberals, again, one of our other isms, but Bismarck appropriated it to promote Prussian expansion and conservative, another ism, rule. So liberals, remember, are capitalists oftentimes, and they're certainly pro-capitalist. And in most of the German states, including Prussia, but Austria and Hanover and Saxony and some of the really small ones as well, it tended to be the capitalist middle classes, the capitalist liberal classes that wanted to unify because a unified economy everybody that was a businessman recognized to be much better for their business, at least for most business people. So liberals are already on board in many ways, but a lot of people in other Germanies were high on this idea, not so much the kings or leaders in these other countries, because they were going to lose power, but many people, businessmen and farmers alike, average people, loved the idea of a united Germany, partly because it was something that they could sort of be proud of in terms of its power and its presence and place sort of, at the head table of European or world powers even. Bentley, our beloved guy, says the unification of Italy and Germany made it clear that when coupled with strong political, diplomatic, and military leadership, nationalism had enormous potential to mobilize people who felt a sense of national kinship. So unification of both Italy and Germany are great examples of the power of nationalism, in this case harnessed to a specific purpose, bringing peoples together of a same cultural and ethnic background, but who previously hadn't been living in the same country politically. The impact of German unification was far-reaching. You see on the left there, Germany after unification, but it has some of the colors in there which show the German states basically before unification. So, and it had been more complicated than that and divided in earlier centuries. But Prussia is the area in blue, which is by far the most powerful one at that point. But in 1871, this is carried out. Everything inside that sort of red line, that's colored either blue or yellow or whatever those other colors are, green, etc. That's all the new Germany. So if you look at Austria to the bottom right, Belgium and France off to the left, you can see that the other countries are now concerned. They didn't have to worry about Germany that much before because it was divided politically, which meant it was divided militarily and strategically, technologically in many ways as well. But now that it's united, look out. They became an industrial, military, economic power, strategic power overnight. That doesn't mean that people thought World War II and Hitler are coming around, because they didn't know about there would be a World War II and Hitler. It doesn't even mean that it was inevitable that happened, but certainly we must look back to try to understand how the Second World War came about and was more or less started by Germany. We have to look at sort of this event right here. The unification of Germany put Germany on the map as a major power in the world, kind of out of nowhere. So Brandon Sims, a recent book on European diplomacy in this era, said the United Germany was by any standard a colossus. With a population of 41 million people, it was larger than France at 36 million and Britain at 31 million. Harnessed to this demographic motor was a rapidly industrializing economy, the best educational system in the world, which is true. The German university was considered the best by Americans, by the Brits, by basically everybody else. And they all sent their kids there, and an army which was second to none. That said nice and succinctly, but this was now a concern. The balance of power in Europe may be tipped or could be tipped by this new kind of major force. Professor Perry saying no nation in Europe was a match for the new Germany. The unification of Germany created fears, tensions, and rivalries that would culminate in world wars. Again, he's not saying that those world wars were destined to happen, but that we have to look back and see this is a major formative evolution of German power. So Germany could have gone a different direction and not caused two world wars. That I think is within the realm of possibility. It didn't work out that way. So this was a milestone moment indeed. Lastly, but not least, comes the Zionist movement, led, at least again at the sort of top of the list of important leaders, by Theodor Herzl. This is Jewish nationalism. And this you could see as a good or a bad thing, depending on your point of view, because it led to, we won't get to it in this class, but it led to the creation of Israel as the sort of new and Jewish state. And the movement started in Europe, primarily from this and other related leadership, Theodor Herzl, who was sort of looking for a solution for the Jewish problem of Jews being spread to the Jewish diaspora, as it's called, around the world, and being minorities in every European country. Jews were living everywhere, but they weren't a majority anywhere. So Perry says about this situation, anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, and the success of the Italians, Germans, Serbians, and others in achieving political independence stirred nationalist feelings among Jews. Jewish nationalism took the form of Zionism, a movement advocating the return of Jews to Palestine, their historic homeland. A key figure in the emergence of Zionism was Theodor Herzl, pictured on the right, an Austrian journalist who was horrified by the anti-Semitism he witnessed in Paris during the Dreyfus trial. Dreyfus trial, famous court case in France where an army officer was convicted of treason. He was a Jewish army officer, a French citizen, but he got convicted wrongly, as it turned out, and much of the case against him, or hatred thrown at him as a traitor, which he wasn't, was because of, again, anti-Semitism, racism. In The Jewish State, a book that he wrote, he argued, Herzl, that the creation of a Jewish state was the best solution to the Jewish question. He actually says, pretty famous words at some point in that book, old prejudices against us still lie deep in the hearts of people. I say that we cannot hope for a change in the current feeling. The nations in whose midst Jews live are all either covertly or openly anti-Semitic. Palestine is our ever memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. And that last part is certainly true. Jews who were spread all over the world, only a sprinkling of them still living in Palestine at all at this point. Some of them have been kind of trickling back in even before the Zionist movement took off. But Palestine had always held a large place in Jewish culture, Jewish, religious, observance and culture wherever Jews lived, whether it was England, France, Poland, Russia. They're still, in a sense, were connected to a place, Palestine, that most of them had never even been to before. So it was an attractive, in some ways, kind of romantic idea that we're going to unite Jews like they haven't been united since the ancient world, when they did have their own kingdom in Palestine. And this, of course, at the time was just an idea, and they would have to get governments to support it. And the first one they got to support it just after Herzl died, a little over 10 years after he died, was Great Britain in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, just near the end of World War I. But other further steps came after that, and the creation of the modern state of Israel came just after World War II, with also the important support of the United States. But of course, it set off all kinds of controversy, which still rages even now, because the Arab peoples and Muslim peoples of the region and around it have not been wild, understandably, about a state carved out by more powerful nations like Great Britain and the United States, right in sort of Arab Middle Eastern territory. So depending on what you think of the state of Israel, Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement, are a positive or negative example of nationalism.